Let's bring in James Peterson, MSNBC contributor and director of Africana Studies at Lehigh University, Eddie Glaude Jr., MSNBC contributor and chairman of African American Studies at Princeton University, and Ken Blackwell, a member of President Trump's Voter Fraud Commission and former Ohio Secretary of State. Good afternoon to all of you, gentlemen.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
James, so there's a lot to get to here, so let's kind of take this a step at a time and start with President Trump's handling of the violence in Charlottesville. So many people believe this moment encapsulates the impact he's had on race relations. Do you agree? How big of a moment was that the words that you heard there at the top of this interview?
Well, it was one in a long list of powerful indicators that this president is a fairly devout racist. But, Chanel, I want to take it one step back and just help folks understand, you know, racism is real and racism has real consequences.
Is he racist or just insensitive toward racial issues? And, you know, people get all hot and bothered when you say the word racist, but what would you say?
He's racist. He's racist. And his comments suggest that. Also his policies. Look at the Muslim ban. Look at how he talks about immigration with respect to Mexicans. Look at all the various dog whistles and direct ways in which he's talked about folks of color over the course of his lifetime. Look at what he did in terms of the Central Park Five. There are too many examples that suggest that Donald Trump is a racist. But I just want folks to understand that racism has physiological consequences for black folks. There's a growing body of research that's showing folks that the psychosocial stressors of racism have physiological consequences such that every 7 minutes a black person dies prematurely. So yes, there's the violence of racism like we saw in Charlottesville where someone can actually be physically killed, but racism also has these psychosocial stressors that impact black folks at an alarming rate.
So you think this is almost like a domino effect of stress, if you will? Let me bring in some more numbers here. Ken, look at this. According to a recent Pew poll, 30% feel there's no difference in race relations since President Trump's election. 8% say it's gotten better. But look at this, 60% feel it's gotten worse. So, Ken, what do you think overall? Do you think Charlottesville made it worse? Or I will say kind of, you know, what he was just alluding to, a lot of people weren't surprised. It frankly just validated what they think he thinks or what's in his heart.
Look, I think history is a dynamic process. We can take a snapshot and freeze on it and miss some of the broader and more important dynamics. We had a tremendous opportunity in 2008 when we elected the first celebrated biracial president. There was an opportunity for the president to lead. By 2012, President Obama had in fact moved away from bringing all of us together to a strategy of divide and conquer. And it worked for him. So look, we are going to solve racial problems in our nation not by presidential decree, whether it's from Obama or from Trump. We're going to do it at the local level. At the macro level, I will say this: we are much better in a position to affect racial reconciliation when we have a growing economy as opposed to a contracting or anemic economy where it becomes more like musical chairs. You know, it is a zero-sum game where somebody wins and somebody loses. And as a consequence, what we have is a situation where I think he is contributing to establishing a context for racial reconciliation by affecting economic growth and job creation.
Let me get you in here. I think that the challenge is, I think we recognize that there are all things that we can do, but people do believe that there is some responsibility on the president's end. You know, what would you say?
Well, look, let's be clear. President Trump campaigned as a bigot, and he's governed as a bigot. And I want to be very, very clear about that. I think Brother James has just laid that out very, very clearly. What we do know is that the economic policies that the president and the Republicans have put forward and that Ken is celebrating will deepen inequality in this country. We have studies from the Institute of Policy Studies and nonprofit Prosperity Now, that says that by the mid-21st century, African-American household wealth, median wealth will be 1%. And this tax bill will exacerbate that inequality. And let's look at it. Let's look at what's happening in the Justice Department, where the president is reneging on police decrees. Let's look at what's happening in terms of education and what Betsy DeVos is doing in DOE. Let's look at what's happening at EPA and what's going to happen to urban communities that are disproportionately experiencing environmental racism. What we see here is the revenge of old white men. We see it in his cabinet. In the White House. We see it in those gatherings outside of Senator Scott. We see it in those gatherings in front of the White House to celebrate some legislative achievement or deregulation. What this is, in my view, is the last gasp of a version of America that the demographics say is, in effect, dead. And the implication for black communities and for black people and for communities of color generally is deepening precarity, deepening sense of threat. And I just want to say, in light of what James mentioned earlier, we just lost Erica Garner. Erica Garner was the daughter of Eric Garner, who said, "I can't breathe," and who died at the hands of New York police officers. At 27, leaving 2 babies behind. And what we know is that Erica was fighting for a more just America. Donald Trump has engaged in the latest iteration of the culture wars. And no matter what we try to say in terms of President Obama, in terms of what Democrats are doing, let's keep this out of partisan politics and just look at the facts. And the fact is that he's trying to introduce or defend a version of America that is dying and that will inevitably we will have to bury.
Ken, I think, what's your response to this? I think there's this challenge of, you know, we play these sound bites and we play these clips where the president says what he's supposed to say, so to speak. But then they are talking about, these gentlemen are talking about policy, about, you know, the things that people are dealing with day in and day out. How do you reconcile this tap dance? And first of all, their reality, despite what he says. What would you say?
Well, here's what I say. And I bring it from my experience. I've led a city as a mayor, and I've protected millions and billions of dollars of assets of taxpayers' money as a treasurer. And let me just say to you that on the street, mothers are just as concerned about their kids being shot by gangbangers as they are about what the president says, you know, about this or about that.
No, listen, let me jump in just a little bit, because that is valid. But does that mean that we still shouldn't be talking about Trump's behavior?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. It means that we must engage, and we have to understand that it takes 2 to tango. This is not just about victimology. There are people historically in the black race who have actually believed that we have to contribute to our own upliftment, whether that was Frederick Douglass or Marcus Garvey. And at the end of the day, we have a responsibility to say safety in our neighborhoods is not just about what Trump says, but it's about what we do, church member to church member, neighbor to neighbor, and stop the killing of black people by other black people.
But in making that claim, Ken Blackwell, even if I were to stipulate to that claim, it doesn't let anyone off the hook. So to say that we have a responsibility in our own communities
from Obama
is one
to Trump, we need to speak up.
Oh, from Obama to Trump, absolutely, absolutely. We have a responsibility to identify policies that disproportionately impact our communities, and to identify rhetoric, right, that deepen racial divides. Donald Trump has engaged in an all-out assault on civility. He has engaged, he doesn't even engage in racial dog whistles, Brother James. He uses a foghorn. I mean, we just saw it in terms of his invocation of crime, that Doug Jones was soft on crime. That made no sense. Just the facts. It just makes no sense on the facts of the matter.
Immigrants.
What about Americans? What about Americans that cling to their guns and their Bibles? Was that a dog whistle?
Listen, we're not. Listen, this segment is not about us playing whataboutism, Mr. Blackwell. With all due respect, there are activists and organizers and scholars and communities on the ground who are working.
This is not a lecture.
This is not a lecture
from you
who are working
to me.
To address issues that you're raising.
Let me jump in here. If we were to have constructive dialogue, let me go to another topic then, but it still obviously circles around race. Let's talk about, let's pivot here, and I think it will showcase what we're talking about. Let's talk about Omarosa for a moment, okay? Whether people liked her or not, her departure exposed, or at least brought the topic back to light, of the lack of racial diversity in the White House. So let's talk about that for a moment, right? So this has nothing to do with mothers being upset about what's going on in the streets of Chicago or whatever. This is one part about just, frankly, the diversity in the White House. What would you say to that, Ken, if we just keep it with that narrow lane?
I tell you, Omarosa and Ben Carson and a number of folks at second and tertiary levels in the government who are black, you know, have been courageous because they have been assaulted as being sellouts and Uncle Toms and
But now she's not there anymore.
For, in fact, engaging. And I
think
can't wait
there's been
for her tell our book. For her tell
there's
our
been
book
an internal
so we can
debate,
get
though.
her side of the story.
Sure, I agree. I'm sure she's going to get a seven-figure deal. But I think there's been an internal debate among black Republicans about why was Omarosa appointed in the first place. There have been black Republicans, and you know this, Mr. Blackwell, who have been, shall we say, carrying the Republican banner for a while, who actually had resources, who had connections to communities, who could actually broker on behalf of communities in light of the ideology that they were committed to. And so to appoint Omarosa in the first place, for some black Republicans, was in some ways a jab in the eye, right? Was an example of, in some ways, the deafness of the Trump administration in relation to black issues in the black community.
I would say ditto for Ben Carson in that administration as well. Same deal. Underqualified, far more conservative black folks who had different qualifications to run the department that Ben Carson is running. But that diversity in terms of representation, Chanel, in an administration, that's too symbolic, right? We need to speak specifically about the real world issues of racism. Racism has deleterious consequences on people of color across the spectrum, and this administration, through policy as well as through rhetoric, has stoked the flames of racism in this country.
You brought it back full circle, and unfortunately, I'm out of time. I could talk to you guys for the next 3 hours on this one. James Peterson, Eddie Glaude, and Ken Blackwell, thank you for your time, and I hope in 2018 we can continue to have the discussion. Have a safe New Year, guys.
You too. Take care.
God
Coming
bless.
up.